Welcome. Welcome back to my channel Conquer the Fear. In this video, we are going to discuss about the top 10 interview questions asked for Spring Boot configuration. Okay, so whether you are a fresher just stepping into the Java world, an experienced developer, or an experienced Spring Boot developer preparing for your next big opportunity, or if you are a software engineer aiming to sharpen your backend skill, understanding the Spring Boot configuration is very important. Now, in real world IT interview, Spring Boot isn't about just creating the REST endpoints or a REST API. It is about knowing how your application is going to behave in your different environments, how it is well configured, how it is well maintained. Now, recruiters are often going to deep dive into how well you can manage your external properties. Now, they are going to ask you about how you can switch between the environments, how you can secure your sensitive configuration. Now, help you stay ahead, I will be going to compile you the top 10 real world Spring Boot configuration interview questions asked in top tech companies. Now I'm going to give you the practical answers. So stay back with me and watch the video till the end. In the video, now how does Spring Boot handle the configuration management? Now this is one of the commonly asked interview questions. You will definitely find this in the any interview you're going to attend. Spring Boot is going to support the external configuration, which you can define the properties. Okay, application.properties or application.yml. Now, in this, you can define your OS related, environment related variables, command line argument is there, external config server is there. So, Spring Cloud configuration is can be defined. Now, if you can relate this can be related to the microservice configuration where you have your configuration externalized, okay, and you define those properties over there. Okay, now there is also a concept called order of precedence, okay, from high to low. Now there is the way it actually try to take the precedence is that it is going to be the first command line interface, then it is going to check in the properties application.properties or yml in the config subdirectory, then it is going to check in the root directory of this application.yml or properties, then the profile specific configuration, like if you have some environment related configuration like staging related, development related, features related, production related things, then comes there will be a default configuration there where you have the annotation at the rate configuration properties. Now what will happen is that this will allow you having the separation of configuration from the code and the environment which you are having to define this particular specific configuration, so it is easily maintained and it is well maintained over there. I hope this particular question is clear to you and how you know how to answer this. Now, what is the difference between at the rate value and at the rate configuration? Now, which one is preferred? Okay, now you must have come across this particular question when it comes to the profiling part. Okay, now at the rate validation is an annotation which is used for injecting your individual property. Okay, now let's say you wanted to get some values from the properties. Let's say you wanted to get the name. Okay, then what you have to do is that you have to give that particular exact property name inside this under this particular dollar signal, and then you have to assign it to the any of this particular variable over here, like how I've given the example over here. Now there is also an annotation called at the rate configuration property, which is going to bind your group of related properties to a certain pojo. Okay. Now you have to define that particular pojo. You have to annotate it at the rate component. Then you have to define that at the rate configuration property we already discussed. Then you can give some prefix according to your standard of your company. Then you have to define a class where you can mention any good name over there, so you can define the name, you can define the version and get a set of property. Now the preferred thing over here is that you have to define the annotation at the rate configuration, which is much more cleaner, much more supportive for the complex database, and it is going to support your validation as well. Okay, now this is how you can do this particular thing. Okay? These are the differences when it comes to at the rate value and at the rate configuration. Okay, these are two different things. Now the preferred one which we already discussed at the rate configuration property is the much more cleaner one. Now how do you configure the multiple environments? Now this is very quite important question. Now let's say you in your production you have a different environment. Let's say you have a you're doing the development and you have a different environment, you have feature environment, your test environment is there. Now how do you have this particular different environment and the different configuration? So you can create multiple properties. Let's say for the development environment, you can maintain the application properties for the dev environment, for the test environment and the production environment separately in the configuration. So in order to activate this particular thing, what you have to do is that there is a command over here, that the hyphen d spring profile, that active. So if you do dev over there, the dev will be the active profile. If you are giving the environment, then you will get test environment, or you can give the test environment, or you can mention same thing in the properties file also. Let's say you have this particular common properties file, that is application.properties. In that you can define, like, the which is the active profile. Okay, so in this way you can have this particular multiple environments defined for that and configure. Also you can define that in the YML, like, the spring profile dev and then your app name. Similar way for the production and environment. So these are the configuration which you need to maintain, and also you can decide the way in which application.yml or properties, that's up to your choice. Now how do you secure your sensitive configuration? Let's say you have your DB passwords. How do you secure it, right? Now there is an environment variable. Let's say spring data source password, right? Now you can actually annotate with that particular DB, the dollar signal, and then the variable name over there. Now using the spring cloud config server, which is maintained in the vault integration, you can pick up that. Okay, now if you see, there is an encrypt property which is using the jazz or a spring cloud vault. Now example, there is using of jazz script. Now you can define the password in that particular encrypted in the string, right? This is how we can actually secure your configuration in the like, the sensitive information like database passwords. Now what is the use of this at the rate property source, and how it is going to be different with the application.property? Now this is one of the annotation which is used for loading your custom properties. Okay, let's say you are maintaining the Spring Boot configuration and you define your at the rate configuration class over there. You have to annotate with the at the rate and property source, and then you have to give that particular details of the properties name. Okay, so let's say the name is custom.properties. So in the class path you have maintained it. Now you have to define that particular class. You have to annotate with this particular two annotation what I've given here. Now this is used for only, like, additional sources, not for the main configuration. Let's say the main configuration we already discussed, but if you are using at the rate property source, you want to load multiple or a legacy, properties files. In that case we use that particular, and you doesn't want to use the application.properties. In that reason, or in that case, we use at the rate property source. Okay, so that in this way it is different, where you doesn't want it to make this particular configuration to be picked up from the application.properties. In that case we use this particular property source. Now, how do you reload your configuration at runtime in Spring Boot? Now, this is one of the commonly asked questions. Now, Spring Boot is not going to support dynamic property reload out of the box, right? So, what you have to do is that there are different options. Now, there is in Spring Cloud config, there is an annotation called refresh scope, and if you see there in the actuator, actually there is an endpoint called refresh. Okay, so what you have to do is that you have to annotate with the refresh scope at the let's say you are defining the in the controller level, right? And you annotate with the at the rate controller. Now you define those particular, controller name and the details, and you see I have written one attribute over here, that is the message, and I have mapped that particular at the rate value with the dollar signal over here. Now post Spring Boot X, this is going to support your relayed Y actuator. Okay, and the Spring Boot config dependency. So make sure you understand this particular thing, and if you are working on the latest Spring Boot version, make sure you apply this. Now what is the spring application builder, and how you can use this particular customized configuration? I'm damn sure that you must be hearing this particular interview question for the first time, because this is very rarely asked. But if it is asked, you must be in a condition to answer this. Okay, Now, what is Spring Boot application builder? It is going to be a chain, or it is going to be the advanced configuration which is used in the Spring Boot application. Now let's say you can use this particular constructor which is going to pass your application class, and then you can define your profiles over there, you can define the properties over there, you can, and then ultimately you can run this application. Now when do we use it? Whether you want to set your certain profiles at the programmatic way, whether you want to do some additional default properties, or whether you are creating a parent child context over there. In that case, you can use this particular customized configuration. Okay, so make sure if the interviewer asks this, make sure you have this particular crisp answer. Now, how you can use the YML instead of the properties files in the Spring Boot? Uh, okay. Now, what you have to do is that the answer is simple, right? You doesn't want your application.properties, then you have to just rename it to the application.yml, and then you have to define in that particular properties how it is being in the hierarchy. Okay. So now, if you have noticed, or if you are aware, application.yml or the yml format is little bit different, and it is maintained in the hierarchy way, and it is much more in the readable way. Okay, so Spring Boot is going to parse your yml automatically if there is no application.properties, and it is going to support the multiple profiles as well. So make sure you maintain it within this, like you are using this particular triple hyphen over there, right? So make sure you use this. Now, how do you validate the properties in the configuration properties? Now, there is an annotation called validator, and there is an JSR303 annotation. Now, when you're using this particular validated, okay, along with that component or configuration properties, you can define that particular class, and you can have this particular validation. Let's say you wanted to have that particular string name as a not blank, or let's say you wanted to have that particular timer to be minimum one to be defined, right? So this kind of validations, if these are failing, right, your application will throw an exception at the startup itself, and your application will not go startup only. So these are very important, that particular this validation has to be happened at the configuration level. Now, how do you use the default value in that configuration if a property is not set? Now, you have at the rate value annotation. Okay, so you can define you can define the colon, and then you can define the particular value. Let's say if the default value is some value is not coming, then what is the default value in that case you have to assign? It will be the colon value you have to define. Now you can also do this with the configuration properties, and then you can use that particular variable and then maintain that. So you can actually set this at the global level in the application.properties. I hope these questions are relatable, and also you understand how to answer those particular questions when these particular interview questions are asked in your real world interview. Okay, I hope this video was very helpful. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Thank you for watching the video.